Hi everyone, welcome to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. Delighted on this episode to be talking for a second time with author David Avallone. David, thank you for jumping in, joining, and talking with me for a few minutes.
My pleasure, Jason. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. I see some very cool, like a Batmobile collection back there and some
That
Planet of
is,
the
I can
Apes.
I can crow a little bit. The Batmobile collection that you see over my left shoulder. I write for a kids show called Bat Wheels for
Nice.
WB Animation, and
Hmm.
that is the Bat Wheels set. And I have to say, uncharacteristically for me, I haven't taken them off the box yet and played with them.
Yes, yeah.
Uh, I
That would
haven't had
be
them long
very
enough.
tempting.
The sweetest thing when I was up for that gig for I was up for that gig for a while before we nailed it down. And my wife went out and bought they didn't have official Bat Wheels toys yet, but my wife bought the Hot Wheels Bat collection to give to
Nice.
me as a gift when I signed the contract with Warner Brothers for that. So those are out and I'm playing with them. But the Bat Wheels cars I haven't taken off their out of their box yet. But I
Cool,
will. There's
cool.
also a Batcave playset that's really nice, but I have to sell another script to them before I can afford the the Bat Wheels playset. I do not have the money for that just yet.
But surely they're giving you the comp versions.
Wouldn't
No?
that be
Oh,
nice?
that would be
Wouldn't that be
so
nice? I
nice.
think the showrunner had to go out and buy those. I'm not sure though.
Oh, gotcha, gotcha.
I don't mean to defame my corporate overlords, but no, the writers of
No.
the show do not get free Bat toys. Uh,
Well, they should. They absolutely should. But glad that you're creating in the world of Batman and Bat Wills as well.
Yeah, it's
Very
fun.
cool.
There are people for whom like they get into comics only because they want to write Batman, and
Mhm,
that
mhm.
is not me at all. Like I love all the characters with the big two, um, and would be happy to write any of that stuff, but that was never, original creation is more interesting to me, and working for Dynamite, I have a degree of creative freedom that I just know I would not have if
Oh, I'm
I was
sure. Yeah.
writing something with a stricter licensor. So
Yes.
it's but I enjoy it, but even with the constraints, because Bat Wheels is also for very small children. It's a
Mhm.
preschool show. I always tell people I'm writing a Batman show in which he cannot punch anyone.
That's right. But you're probably the first introduction to this character for like an entire generation now. So
That
that's
is
kind of the
the
cool thing.
I mean, that is the secret mission, I think, of shows like Bat Wheels is
Hmm.
you're trying to create a brand association and fondness that will have these kids buying comics and going to Batman movies for the rest of their natural
That's
lives,
right. That's right.
because they dug it as a kid. And that, I think that's borne out. I saw my first James Bond movie when I was 7 years old. I'm still even Sam Mendes could not completely shake me from my love of James Bond. Certainly the most dangerous supervillain he ever faced was the director of American Beauty. But all that said, yeah, no. So the idea is to give kids a fondness for the character. And I will say, like the very first time I opened Final Draft and clicked the button for character name and wrote Batman
Hmm.
dialogue was was something. Was really something. I mean, that's
Oh,
a
yeah.
because that's a big character. And even though my love of various versions of that franchise comes and goes just depending on who's doing it. The character itself is bigger than that, and to
True.
be part of that, I mean, 1,000 people have written Batman,
Hmm.
but to be part of that history. My first ever writing gig was writing Star Wars short stories for the role playing game.
Yeah.
And I always
Yeah.
used to say, and I've heard other people make this comparison, it's like, I am not a significant contributor to Star Wars mythology. I did kill IG-88 in 1989. So, that was, I feel good about that.
Yes.
But,
Yes.
um, but I always say, it's like you're working for a Renaissance architect.
Uh-huh.
And like, I didn't design the building, I didn't build the building, but that flying buttress right there and that gargoyle, the one
Uh-huh.
tenth from the right,
That's
500 feet
yours.
up, that's my gargoyle that I made on this immense, gaudy cathedral. So that's always part of the professional writing thing.
Hmm.
If you get
Hmm.
lucky, you do something defining, you do something that sticks around for a while. I'd like to think I've contributed seriously to the legacy of Elvira. I think
I
I did
think so. Yeah.
I think I did pretty good bringing Betty Page back as a comic book character.
Hmm. Hmm.
I think I don't know that anybody read my Zorro issues, but they are excellent.
They are.
And
They are
and anything,
indeed.
well, thank you. And people should read them and enjoy them. But yeah, there's always that in any writer's life, that there's that balance, any professional writer's life, that balance between the stuff you write that other people created, the Gothic cathedrals that you contribute to, and the things you build from the ground up. And that's, obviously you're always going to feel, I mean, maybe I shouldn't say that. There are probably people who just aren't the type of creators where the stuff they come up with is more important to them than the
Hmm.
contribution to a mythology.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
you know, for all that I love the works of Nicholas Meyer and Alan Moore, nothing they did that doesn't rely on other people's creations is that significant compared to, Nicholas Meyer's Star Trek and Sherlock Holmes
Hmm.
contributions and Alan Moore's contributions to, you know, I mean, one could argue that Watchmen is original, but it's a pretty thin slice of originality on top of a thing that someone already created.
Hmm. Hmm.
And again, that's not to he's the best at that.
Yeah. Yeah.
His rewriting of Swamp Thing's origin story is still some of the best comic book writing I've ever seen in my life. And it
Absolutely.
unfortunately, when geniuses do something really hard and make it look really easy, Alan Moore sadly spawned a zillion everything you know is wrong takes
Hmm.
on
Hmm.
characters when you can't, like, you can do that with Swamp Thing.
Right.
You
And
can
it
do
worked. Yeah.
you can do the lonely man looking for his humanity was never a man and never had any humanity to reclaim, and that's a heartbreaking, beautiful thing. But then you get guys pitching Krypton never exploded, and it's like,
Right.
man, don't go home. You're drunk. You know, Thomas Wayne is a bad guy. Must we really
Right. Right.
give it
Yeah.
up? Like you're trying too hard to do something original with Batman. Forget screwing around with the origin. It's a pretty good origin.
It
You know,
is. It's pretty
it's
solid.
it's pretty solid. And the best work in it has been from people who respect it. Uh
Hmm. Hmm.
Ironically, I would say that the Harley Quinn episode about Batman's origin is probably the best commentary on that origin I've ever seen in my life. And for
Yeah.
something that's a hilarious show, heartbreaking and serious in its own way. I don't know if you caught that episode, but
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
that in Batman's brain, when he's sleeping, all he sees is the murder of his parents everywhere he looks is just
Yeah.
that's devastating. And that's just good writing. That's,
Yeah. For
that's good
sure.
stuff. So
For
anyway.
sure. Yeah, yeah. Well, the you mentioned Elvira. I was gonna bring up a couple of the things that you've done since last we talked. And
Mhm.
I think when last we talked, Elvira was in the world of The Shining. And
Oh
currently
yeah.
we have H.P. Lovecraft
Yes.
and some of the Lovecraftian influences coming in.
Mhm.
So love how you're taking this person, this celebrity and kind of world, and then weaving her together with all of these other elements.
Well, I mean, that's, when I took the gig, my initial reaction, I have to say, was, what the hell am I going to do with Elvira? What kind of adventures can she have? She's a woman who introduces horror movies and makes off-color jokes about them. And then I went, well, then let's have her interact with the creators of horror and with
Hmm.
these works. So she's time traveled and met Mary Shelley and Edgar Allan Poe, and she's invaded iconic horror movies like, I think you said the last time we spoke, it was issue 2 of Elvira in Horrorland, which was the
Hmm.
Shining issue. So I've mostly used her as, I have 100 good jokes about The Shining. Let's use Elvira as the vehicle for that. And I think it helps when you have a fondness for these things. I
Hmm.
can honestly say that I did the Freddy Krueger issue. I don't want to say under duress, but my artist on that, Sylvia Califano, is a huge Nightmare on Elm Street fan, and she brought up that she loved those movies, and I was like, I don't want to, but let me dive back in and see what I have to say about those movies. And I protected myself to the degree that I only watched the Wes Craven movies.
I was
Uh,
gonna say, did you watch
and I
them
only
all?
referenced so the comic book she invades episodes 1, 3, and 7, and the rest of the movie she leaves alone
Hmm.
because I'm very much not interested in the series outside of the Wes Craven of it all.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but yeah, it's a little like the series that followed that, Elvira in Monsterland. The issue that was like pulling teeth was the Wolfman issue
Mm-hmm.
because again, there aren't really a lot of good Wolfman movies. Like, there's some pretty good vampire movies out there, and I'm not even particularly a vampire fan. But man, a lot of Wolfman movies are pretty bad. And the good news is you can make a lot of jokes about Teen Wolf.
That's
Um,
true. That's true.
and I stretched so that I could make fun of the Wolf of Wall Street because I thought that was a good joke to drag in
Yeah,
there. But
yeah.
it's easier. Like I have a love-hate relationship with The Shining, but I can't deny how beautifully made it is, you
Hmm.
know.
Right.
But there are just a lot of jokes to make about the making of that film and the content of that film and the content of Kubrick. And I'm a huge fan of Kubrick, which is
Yeah.
why Room 247 becomes Room 2001, because I think that's
It
let's
works.
always get Dave Bowman in there if we can. One of my
Yeah.
favorite movie characters of all time. So yeah, so with the Lovecraft series we're in the middle of now, Lovecraft was a very formative influence on me as a writer. I discovered him after Poe. My father had a paperback copy of the Dunwich Horror and Other Tales, and I think I read Dunwich Horror first. And the series is kind of a trip through my favorite Lovecraftian stuff. And of course, the man himself was a garbage fire in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
Um, Ironically, I actually think pound for pound, Edgar Allan Poe was a worse human being, but he doesn't have that reputation.
Hmm. Hmm.
Because what was horrible about Poe is not well known. You can read every book Edgar Allan Poe ever wrote and not know that he married a 12-year-old. You know,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
whereas you can't read everything Lovecraft wrote and not discover he was a racist. Like it's right there in the book.
Hmm. Hmm.
People always say separate the art from the artist, and I always say I'm willing to do that to the degree that the artist is not endlessly confessing.
True. True.
If Woody
Yeah.
Allen made less movies about sex with underage girls, I would probably find the movies easier to watch. But
Right.
you go
Right.
back and watch them and you go like, there it is.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
like literally 5 movies ago, he made a movie about a guy having an affair with a middle-aged woman, and then her daughter comes to town and he starts sleeping with the daughter. And I'm like, really? You couldn't just stay away from the having sex with the daughter of your girlfriend theme. Yeah, you
Yeah.
dude, just don't make a movie about that particular thing, and people will find it easier to. I just, and it's and Polanski. It's like say what you will about Polanski, but at least he knows the rapist is the bad guy in all of his movies.
Right. Right.
Like so. There's
Yeah.
some slight flicker of self-awareness. Particularly when you look at the nature of Polanski's crimes, it's like literally Rosemary's Baby and Chinatown are about like rapes that are enabled by people who are supposed to be protecting the woman who is raped.
Hmm. Hmm.
Rosemary is set up to be raped by Satan by her husband, and literally Evelyn Mulray's father raped. It's like so when the mother drops off the 15-year-old girl with you, you know exactly what's happening, Roman. Cool. Like
Yeah.
you're aware of what crime you're committing and who's enabling it. But anyway, so with Lovecraft, there are plenty of stories that you can read that really, if you don't know he's a racist, it doesn't really register on you quite so much.
Hmm.
Um, and to me, the best stories of his don't really have all that much of that. And so I'm sort of drawing from, if the first story I read of his was the Dunwich Horror,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
if the only Lovecraft you ever read is the Dunwich Horror, you would absolutely conclude that he is racist against white hillbillies. Because the villains in the Dunwich Horror are white country folk having sex with demons and each other's family members. Like it's a very, it's not
yeah,
uh
yeah.
that's a movie about inbred hill folk.
It's not a
Um
bedtime story. Not a
Not a
great
bedtime
bedtime story.
story.
Yeah.
So, I referenced that one in the second book, in the second issue. The third issue, which dropped just last week, references the strange high house in the mist, and also references Lovecraft's sometime partner and friend August Derleth.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
in a world where people cared more about H.P. Lovecraft, I would have legions of angry August Derleth fans after me for that issue, but nobody cares. No, nobody really cares.
Yeah.
Perhaps there is some August Derleth Reddit page where they are ready to burn me in effigy, but I don't think so.
Not you
Largely
haven't
because
gotten that yet. No
I suggest
correspondence.
that I suggest that Derleth sort of took advantage of his friend after he was dead and made his literary reputation uh off of his dead buddy.
Hmm.
His
Hmm.
literary
Hmm.
reputation and a great deal of money off of his
Yeah.
dead buddy, which is more or less true. But and then the fourth issue, which is coming up next month, is tribute to my favorite thing of Lovecraft, which is the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, which is his
Mm.
one novel, and which is weirdly sentimental for him. It
Yeah.
kind of has the same the moral of the story shakes out to be pretty much the same one of The Wizard of Oz. And when I read it the first time, I was like, that is a wild place for an H.P. Lovecraft story to and like there's no place like home is a pretty wild place for H.P. Lovecraft to end up,
Not what you expect for sure.
80 pages later. So that's fun. And then the fifth one, God, I wrote it 2 weeks ago and I trying to remember what it's about. Um, the the fifth one is we're back to Cthulhu and the Call of Cthulhu and all of that. And
Hmm.
I hope I did something fun and interesting with that character because I would say, the most interesting thing to me about Lovecraft is it's hard to think of a more influential and unread writer.
True.
Like
True.
everybody has an opinion about him. And by the way, this is not me gatekeeping. You don't want to read Lovecraft, great. Like, and if you're fascinated by Cthulhu and have never read a word of Lovecraft, but you've liked the stuff that came later, that's
Hmm.
fine. You don't have to, there are plenty of comic book characters I've never read the first 300 issues of. You know what I mean?
Right.
Written,
Yep.
I don't know that I've ever read a Stan Lee Doctor Strange. And I love
Hmm.
Doctor
Hmm.
Doctor Strange, a great character. I love the comic books I read in the late 70s, early 80s of Doctor Strange. I'm pretty sure there's not an ounce of Stan Lee or Steve Ditko in any of that. And I don't think that
Yeah.
makes me a fraud. I think I'm allowed to like
Yeah.
the Doctor Strange that I encountered and that I read and enjoyed and all that. So it's
Absolutely.
but I think yeah, the ratio between people who have read Lovecraft and people who are familiar with what Cthulhu is and know at least something about the mythology, I don't think there's another ratio that steep
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
pop culture. You know what I mean? Like I
Yeah.
don't know that there's that much like no, I've never read any of that, but I'm super familiar with the squid-headed monster that lives on a stormy island in the Caribbean. That's
Yes.
kind of in another dimension, but kind of not.
They're those books that people love to say they've read or they're
Oh, well,
familiar
there's that
with.
too.
The Knives Out thing of like Gravity's Rainbow, but it doesn't have a guy with a squid face. I don't know that
Yeah.
any part of it has permeated the culture, so I could see
No,
that.
my copy of Gravity's Rainbow no longer has a cover on it because the eighth time I threw it across the room, the
Right.
cover ripped off it, and I have not taped it back together. And
Yes.
I'm Crying of Lot 49 is one of my favorite books, but
Hmm. Hmm.
That fondness does not extend to Someone had to talk me into reading Crying of Lot 49 because I had tried to read Gravity's Rainbow and said no thanks. I'm not going to
No.
pretend I can fight my way through this thing. And yeah, and everybody with Infinite Jest on their and I remember I think my sister was a big fan of Infinite Jest, and she was describing all the great things about it. And I was like, that all of that's in Naked Lunch, so that's interesting. I was like, I kind of feel like William Burroughs got there first on almost all of the things that you're describing. And
Interesting.
again, like, you don't want to be a hipster about it, but I don't mind influence when it's at least passingly acknowledged.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
my joke about Tarantino movies is that they're trivia quizzes, and your reward if you get all the answers right is you hate the movie. Um, if you recognize everything he's referencing, you just get mad,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And it's like, yes, if you've never seen a Don Siegel crime story from the 70s, Pulp Fiction is a revelation.
Right. Right. Being
Um,
the cinema lover that he is.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and no, and not to get off on a tangent, but the frustrating thing for me about him is I think he's a third great, and then another third is kind of mediocre, and then another third is just like bafflingly, what are you even doing here? And in Pulp Fiction, it's the dead body uh scene, which
Hmm.
not only is just sort of appallingly racist, and all of the racism is in the mouth of Quentin Tarantino, which is a fascinating choice that he made.
Hmm.
But but also it's kind of in I mind less the references to 1970s crime films, but watching that and seeing Harvey Keitel play the same part from the American remake of La Femme Nikita that came out a year earlier. I'm like, dude, keep stealing the old stuff. Don't lift things that are a year old. That's that's a big one of these things is not like the other deal. But look,
Yeah.
I traffic in reference all the time. I hope that um I know that as a fan, I always feel like the deep cuts are a just hat tip of like, you're the kid that was paying attention in school, so you get this joke better than everybody else gets this joke. And
Hmm.
I know
Hmm.
I enjoy that as a fan. The third issue of I just someone on Twitter just reached out to thank me for a Sutter Kane reference
Nice.
in and honestly, I was in the first draft of that script, it was Stephen King, and then I went, no, let's abstract it once more.
Yes.
Let's use the fictional, since I'm using a fictional version of August Derleth, let's have them talk about a fictional Stephen King, and that's Sutter Kane and Sutter, and that's such a Lovecraft influenced movie,
Hmm. Hmm.
In the Mouth of Madness. It's like, yeah, no, let's make a Sutter Kane joke. And again, at least one person uh felt. And again, nothing in that scene requires you to know who Sutter Kane is or to get the reference. It's just an author whose name comes up as being very derivative of H.P. Lovecraft, and that's it,
Yeah.
without
Yeah.
uh without much reference.
But you
Uh
made that connection with somebody out
yeah,
there. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And that's like I said, it shouldn't it can never be what drives the story. And I will say that during the Horrorland and Monsterland series, which is two 5-issue series,
Hmm.
where it's all like essentially, especially Horrorland, those are Mad Magazine movie parodies that just happen to have Elvira in them. The Shining one in particular, is like, is this thing just freaking baffling if you haven't seen The Shining? Like, is this even, but the thing is, like, I remember thinking the Mad Magazine satire of The Great Gatsby,
Uh-huh.
the
Uh-huh.
Redford the Great Gatsby. I thought that was hilarious before I had read the book. I had not seen any film adaptation of Gatsby. I had not
Hmm.
seen the Redford movie. I had not read the book. I still thought the jokes all landed, even if you even if your understanding the story is only coming from that,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, especially in the Alien one and the Shining one, I was just like, this is who's even going to know what these jokes are if you're not deeply, deeply familiar with these movies. There's a lot. One of the first lines in the Alien one is she calls Ian Holm Bilbo.
Nice,
And
nice.
under his breath, he mutters, "Well, I also played Frodo on the BBC." And that's true.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
I hope that's funny. Even if you've never heard that Ian Holm played Frodo on the radio adaptation for the BBC. Um, my favorite joke in that issue is when she's parting from Sigourney Weaver from Ripley
Mhm.
and says, "When they ask you to do the third one, say no."
Right.
And Sigourney Weaver says, "I'm sorry, third one, what?" And as Elvira is walking away, she says, "My conscience is clear. Like, I've done everything I could to save her from being an Alien 3. Now it's up to her." Uh, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Now you've worked with Monstrous Books, is that right? And James
Yes.
Aquila? Hmm.
Yes, James. I always like to tell people I got that gig, which has led to a lot of work for me. Not just work with James, but I got that gig by being passive aggressive on Twitter. Um,
Nice, nice.
my friend and colleague, is that Rodney? Rodney Barnes wrote uh, was writing a comic piece in his uh, Kolchak the Night Stalker 50th anniversary anthology.
Hmm.
And he retweeted James, the publisher and editor, and Monstrous, tweeting about the Kickstarter campaign. And I saw it and just replied, "Hey, this looks amazing. If you do a second volume, let me know." And that was all I was really thinking is I want to put myself in this editor's ear as someone who would like to write Kolchak.
Hmm.
And James reached out to me within a week, sent me a message on Twitter, followed me back, and said, "Hey, Phil Hester just dropped out of this anthology. Would you like to write Kolchak?" He was going to write the first story in the book, which is Kolchak as a teenager, as a high school student in 1939, investigating his first supernatural event. And I was like, "That's so me. It's ridiculous. That's so in my wheelhouse in a period I love writing about." Um, and that also, there was a slot open to write a short story. So I
Hmm.
wrote a short story for that. And I hadn't written a short story literally since 1989. I hadn't been paid to write prose in forever. And it's not something that I do without, like, it's not something that I'm not someone typing the great American novel for no pay
Hmm.
uh
Hmm.
in my spare time. It's just not, I don't have that kind of time and I don't have that specific ambition. It's always more of a film guy. But that has led to, I've now contributed to a handful of anthologies writing short stories, not just not just James and Monstrous Books. For Monstrous, I did write a Nick Carter short story, which sort of connected a dot that no one had ever bothered to connect.
Hmm.
Nick Carter's possibly still holds the record as the most published American serialized character because they were biweekly novels in the 19th century. Nick Carter, Private Eye, Private Detective. And then in the 20th century, there were pulps and a radio show and movies and all that, mostly forgotten now. And then in 1964, they asked my father, who was a novelist, to reboot the name Nick Carter, with no other connection really to the 19th century guy,
Hmm.
as a Bondian super spy who worked for a secret organization with a cool name. I think their Axe was the name of the organization before the body spray ruined that name. And had an M style boss and had gadgets that he used in every novel and all that. And when James reached out to me, he suggested he just that was for a thing called the Dead Detectives anthology, Dead
Hmm.
Detective
Hmm.
Society. And I didn't have anything particularly like that, but I started thinking about Nick Carter, and I talked to this incredible librarian of pop culture, librarian of pulp fiction named uh, Jess Nevins, good friend of mine. We met because I contributed online to he did the annotations of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen comics.
Hmm. Hmm.
We met because I contributed some to the James Bond era when he was crowdsourcing information for it. And he had done my podcast Pulp Today to talk about the history of pulp. And like he's the only guy left in the world that knows anything about Nick Carter. And I said, so you've got this 19th century detective and you've got this mid 60s super spy. How do I make them the same guy? And he
Hmm.
said, well, Nick Carter. I said, I can think I can invent things, but you of all people will know if there's anything there. And he said, well, you're in luck. Nick Carter had a supervillain named Dr. Jack Quartz. Really the first Lex Luthor, the first Moriarty, predates Moriarty, the
Hmm.
first
Hmm.
supervillain. And he said, well, Dr. Jack Quartz kept getting arrested and executed, and then just bafflingly was back from the dead 2 years later in a new pulp. And it was never explained. And it wasn't hand waved away so much. Like Nick Carter was like, oh, he's alive again and he's seemingly a little younger. That doesn't make any sense. But it was never explained. And he said, and also Jack Quartz had a suspended animation machine. So I said, okay. So Nick Carter dies in combat in World War II,
Uh-huh.
and the powers that be throw him in the Dr. Quartz suspended animation machine until they figured out how to work the Jack Quartz rejuvenation machine, resurrection machine. And then they brought him back to life in the mid 60s, in the
Hmm.
early 60s. And so that's now none of there are 250 Nick Carter Killmaster novels that come after my father's first novel. In none of them is there this supernatural science fiction element that he's back from the dead. No connection is ever made to the 19th century guy. But I was like, that's the most, if you want me to write about a zombie detective, super spy, whatever, that's the one I got lying around. So let me try that. And obviously, I should mention Nick Carter, 19th century Nick Carter is fully public domain. Um,
Nice, nice.
my dad's is more of a question mark. I don't know that that publisher protected that the way an
Hmm.
author would protect it. But for safety's sake, I didn't name the organization. I didn't name his M character. He fits the physical description of the character in the books, but I didn't use the name because just in case that publisher is a little testy about their rights.
Yeah, yeah. Very smart authoring in so many ways, making the connections and balancing the legal aspects too.
Yeah, well, it's fun being offered these opportunities to play in these worlds and to, it's the thing I was saying earlier about as a fan you feel rewarded, but also as a fan who's a reader, you feel rewarded when your nerdity is
Hmm.
pays
Hmm.
off. Oh, I recognize that reference because I remember when that happened.
Yeah.
Um, but as a writer, it makes you feel like, when I was offered to write Zorro, I was like, well, then I guess I didn't waste my time watching Zorro 10 times when I was a kid
That's
and
right.
being in and reading The Curse of Capistrano 5 years ago and like knowing what I know about the character and being able to. And then on the other side of things, one of the reasons I was excited to write Zorro when I got it is I don't know that much about the Spanish Empire's presence in the United States before the Mexican American War and before
Hmm.
Mexican
Hmm.
independence. So it's like, here's an opportunity. I didn't know that much about the Tongva Indians, who are the native population of Los Angeles before the Spaniards get here. So now I know a lot about Tongva mythology, a little bit about the culture. I know a little bit about the Spanish Empire. I know a little bit about the Mexican Revolution. Um, and that's a gift, to
Yeah.
look into stuff like that, to go like, okay, here's an opportunity to learn something that I don't know about a topic that interests me,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
to, I'm deep down, I am a frustrated history professor. And so I enjoy an opportunity to teach an audience that's there to watch Zorro stab zombies, whether that was the plot of that book, learning a little something about the Tongva Indians in 1805 and the state of the Spanish Empire in Mexico and all that. Like that's a gift to be able to do that and to be able
Yeah.
to pass along that kind of information because it's part of the value we get from all culture and fiction.
Hmm.
of my father never finished high school. He went off to fight in World War II, but he was a tremendously intelligent and well-read autodidact. And he
Yeah.
was the kind of guy that when he was 10 years old and saw A Tale of Two Cities, with Ronald Colman in the 30s, he would take Tale of Two Cities out of the library and read
Hmm.
it. And then he'd go, oh, that's really interesting. And then he'd take out a book on Robespierre and read that. And then he'd read Danton's Death,
Yeah.
the play. So like, and suddenly he's a guy who knows a lot about the French Revolution because he saw a movie, a black and white, 90-minute long adaptation of a 400-page book, and wanted more and wanted to learn more from it. So
Yeah.
I think that idea of, when I did my Doc Savage one, I'm kind of fascinated by the interwar period. And, you meet two Japanese naval officers in it. And I literally like, one of them represents the old guard that thought all this was a terrible mistake. And one of them represents Japanese militarism and imperialism and the those conflicts in Japanese culture. I was able
Hmm.
to write about that in a Doc Savage story because I had these two dudes who could stand in for those two political movements in Japan in the 1930s. Um, and again, it's also, I always say when writers don't do their research, I'm like, the stories are just right there.
Yeah. Truly.
You know what I mean?
Truly.
You could write two generic Japanese naval officers, but who cares about that? And then they're flavorless and you don't know anything about them and they don't have an internal life. But
Hmm.
one guy thinks Japan should conquer the world, and the other guy thinks that's going to lead to disaster and the end of the empire.
Hmm.
And then there's conflict. Then you have two characters who are, who have something going on.
Yeah.
And how that then influences the story. One guy wants to sell out to John Sunlight to take over the world, and one guy knows John Sunlight is bad, and we
Hmm.
shouldn't be dealing with this international terrorist, even if he says he can destroy San Francisco, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I love what you're saying there about building in kind of the history, the foundation, because those are things that give a story like weight and teeth. And otherwise, it's just kind of like could be any story at any point,
Yeah.
at any point in time. Uh,
I have
so,
a I have a book. I had a great professor in college named Peter Skiff, who was technically a science teacher,
hmm.
but he taught
Hmm.
the history of science. And the most highfalutin thing I can say about my education is I became sort of an epistemology major, someone studying the history of
Nice.
ideas, the history of philosophies, and of cosmologies. And he was, to the degree that he had a thesis statement to his entire work in this, it was, I think, the first day of the first class, he said, you've been sold the bill of goods that the humanities are over here and the sciences are over here and that they don't communicate with each other. I don't know if you're familiar with the Steve Martin play, Picasso at the Lapin Agile,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah.
which is Picasso and Einstein. And a decade before Steve Martin wrote that play, he was the one who sort of said to me in class, and he had he's a tall, skinny guy, looked like American John Cleese, and he had that 1950s rocket scientist voice because he was a 1950s rocket scientist. Uh, but he's like, you can't have cubism without atomic theory, and you can't have atomic theory without cubism. Like you might, you don't, you know, Niels Bohr and Picasso are doing the same thing, really, and
Uh-huh.
that
Uh-huh.
that was really influential to me. But he assigned us this book, and I still have it, called The Timetables of History. It's a translation of a German book called the Kulturfahrplan, because that's German for you. But it breaks down all of human history, and I mean all, like going back to Marduk and Babylon,
Mm.
into, like, for want of a better term, the Trivial Pursuit categories.
Yeah.
Here's
Yeah.
daily life, here's science, here's politics, here's sports and leisure, here's the arts, all that. And the thing about that book is that it allows you to go, oh, here's Beethoven and here's Napoleon.
Hmm. Hmm.
Here's, you know, here's this, like, you don't think about this being invented in this year while this is happening in the culture, and the way in which things are inextricable from one another. And it's a thing that I'm always baffled when people write period things. It's one thing to do anachronistic stuff intentionally
Hmm.
because you're sort of making a point of it. But when you have the pretense of uh, period accuracy and you don't bother with it, it drives. I think I was watching. I've been told it's a good show, but I was writing Betty Page at the time that The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel dropped, and I
Uh-huh.
just couldn't. I couldn't sit there like on my budget. I'm getting the period right, man. And if you don't know not to have someone say "Let's do lunch" in 1961, the hell with you. Like I don't have time for that. I don't have time for, I'm enjoying Manhunt. I think the writer of it is a very good writer. But
Hmm.
like in the second episode, Stanton says this is a crime scene. I'm like, that's not. No one said this is a crime scene in 1865. Man, that's not that. This ain't CSI. Like, there's a lot of dialogue, and we're like, this isn't Hill Street Blues. This is,
Yeah. Yeah.
this all this terminology these people are throwing around. No one talked about that, and
Yeah.
the opposite side of that to me is like the Coen brothers who take joy in like you're writing in this period. To me, it's an opportunity to write the poetry of the period.
Hmm.
This is the people don't speak this way anymore. I remember when I handed in my very first issue uh of Betty Page, I had her say, like fun you will, to someone. And the editor, Joe Ryban, literally on Facebook, just like posted like fun you will out of like with no reference. So I'm like, oh, you like that. Um, but like that's just it's a thing people I had a and yeah, I can take it too far, but I had an issue where I wanted Betty to say, do what now? Because I've heard Southerners say that my whole life
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
when they don't do what now. And I went on Facebook and I said, I need someone with a grandma from Nashville to tell me if do what now is a 1970s thing, which is where I started hearing it, or would someone in 1953 say do what now? And someone's grandma from Nashville came back and or was like, she's not from Nashville, but she's from Knoxville, and she assures me that do what now was very common as an expression in the Deep South in the 1950s. I'm like, great.
Love it. Love
Now,
it.
it would have been fine. you know, it would have been. I had an issue of Doc Savage Ring of Fire, which takes place in 1939, where Rennie is saying to trying to remember Long Tom, I think, is playing around with the radio and he gets it to work and under difficult circumstances. And I
Hmm.
had Rennie call him young Tom Edison. He said, good job, young Tom Edison. Now, anyone could make a Tom Edison reference, but there was specifically a movie. Was it Mickey Rooney or Spencer Tracy? There was specifically a movie called Young Tom Edison. Well, it came
Oh,
out in
nice.
1940.
Uh-huh.
And I was like, I changed it to Marconi,
Yeah. Yeah.
inventor of the radio.
Hmm.
Works
Hmm.
just as well. No one in the world would have said to me, oh, the movie Young Tom Edison wouldn't come out for another year. Why is he making that reference? But it would have bugged me.
Yeah.
What was
Yeah.
it? I will not name the author who's an incredibly popular and well-regarded comics writer, set a story in the 1930s and had two Japanese secret agents, military men, whatever,
Hmm.
talking about the American organized crime, and they called it La Cosa Nostra.
Hmm. Hmm.
La Cosa Nostra comes from the Valachi tapes. Literally, the FBI hears about La Cosa Nostra, and then they misunderstand it, by the way, but that's a completely other. They think it's a proper noun when literally La Cosa Nostra means the thing of ours.
Uh-huh.
They're
Uh-huh.
asking Joe Valachi, what do you guys call the mafia among yourselves? And his answer is, we don't call it anything. We call it our thing.
Uh-huh.
And they
Uh-huh.
go, oh, La Cosa Nostra, capital L, capital C, capital N. It's like, no, that's not what he's saying. It doesn't have a name among us. We refer to it elliptically. But anyway, This guy has two Japanese dudes in the 30s using something the FBI wouldn't know about for 25 years. And that bugged the crap out of me. I was just like, come on, man, you're smarter than this. That ain't right.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
You
and we
know,
have so much information to reach out
yeah.
to and to check.
And to me, like I always said, the real thing is always more interesting.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
real thing, like the doing, you don't want to be a prisoner of history and reality and all of that. And depending on the framing of the story, you know,
Hmm.
I always used to say that any story with a president of the United States who's not the historical president of the United States is science. Like The West Wing is a science fiction show
True. True.
because The West Wing takes place in a world where George Bush the first was succeeded by a guy named Josiah Bartlett. That's
Hmm.
already a parallel universe,
Hmm.
you
Hmm.
know. And I remember like their Iraq War thing. I can't remember the name of it, but they also had a fake Middle Eastern country that the United States went, what had a military presence in. So
Yeah.
it's a science fiction show, like undeniably. Like, yeah, there are no
True.
alien invasions on Josiah Bartlett's watch, but it takes place in a parallel universe, undeniably. So I think that allows you a certain there are indicators that go like, no, we don't have to stick to history
Hmm.
because if
Hmm.
Clinton isn't president, then nothing that happened in the 90s happened the way you remember it.
Right.
You know
Yeah.
what I mean? So we don't have to like stick to the reality of that. All that said, though, for me, rather than seeing it as a prison, I think that's the challenge. Make it work within this time period, or change it, or
Hmm.
find a way to do a different story. Then, you know.
Yeah.
And what I was getting to about the timetables of history, when I'm writing period things, I look in it and I
Hmm.
look at
Hmm.
those years, and not just to soak in the culture of it, but also to get inspiration. And honestly, Doc Savage Ring of Fire, the major subplot in it is that Pat Savage is looking for Amelia Earhart, who is, if you read between the lines, her ex-girlfriend.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
that happened because I was looking through the timetables of history and I saw 1938, Amelia Earhart vanished. And I was literally looking for like, what would interest Doc Savage?
Yeah.
And I'm
Yeah.
pretty sure I saw some earthquake or volcano eruption in the Pacific Rim in the Ring of Fire, and that was the other thing. Right?
Mm.
Okay. So increased volcanic activity in the Pacific and this. Cool. I will. And this is as deep research nerdity as I think I've ever gone. The test there's a Doc Savage backstory thing in a novel called Fortress of Solitude, where his enemy, John Sunlight, finds his Fortress of Solitude in the Arctic and steals a bunch of his sci-fi weapons,
Hmm. Hmm.
and ostensibly then gets killed a novel later, but under circumstances where maybe it didn't happen, as far as I'm concerned. So I had him find a weapon that activates earthquakes and volcanoes, like a tectonic plate shifting weapon. I can't remember the harmonic resonance modulator or something. I can't remember what sci-fi name I gave it. But seeing the volcano, I was like, well, what if it's John Sunlight with some super weapon that can activate earthquakes and volcanoes? And I wanted him to test it on a US naval base
Hmm.
on an island in the Pacific. There's a place called Palmyra Atoll. And atoll is a ring, an island that's sort of a ring left
Hmm.
over from volcanic activity. I had him tested on Palmyra Island, which would result in an atoll after you set off a volcano in it.
Interesting.
For
Yeah.
the geology fans reading the comic, like if I was just like, if anyone goes to a map to look up Palmyra Island in the South Pacific, you know, let him maybe go, oh yeah, an atoll. That's what would be left after John Sunlight set off the super weapon that set off a volcano on Palmyra Island. And sometimes there is magic in coincidence. And in
Mm-hmm.
that story, I had, before I had really researched closely into the island chain where Amelia Earhart vanished, I had Pat Savage have a nightmare where uh, Amelia Earhart turns into a phoenix, which was me saying she's not dead, and also something about the volcanic explosions and all this. Well, when I sat down to write the issue, uh, I'm gonna get the facts wrong because it's been a while, but she vanished in the Phoenix Island group.
Oh, how about that?
Like that's not the name of the specific island she was heading towards, but the
Mm-hmm.
island group she was in was the Phoenix Island group. And when I got to writing, I was like, oh, that's how Pat will figure out where she is. She's going to follow the prophecy of having seen the Phoenix in her dreams, and she's going to fly a plane out to Phoenix Island, the Phoenix Island group, to try and find her. And that was unplanned. That was just like there is a small possibility that that piece of information was lodged deep in my brain somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's just like there are these it's that the aviatrix turning into a phoenix thing is just an appealing, if it's good enough for Chris Claremont,
True enough.
to turn a spectacular young woman into a phoenix, I can do it too. So yeah, and it's the same. When I was doing the Kolchak thing,
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
literally looked up interesting things that happened in New York in 1939. I just looked. Coney Island burned down for real in 1939. Now it was a garbage fire, but at the same time, Murder Incorporated under Alberto Anastasia, who had just taken it over from Louis Lemke, was putting pressure on the longshoremen in Brooklyn to organize and to be controlled by organized crime.
Yeah.
So I made the fire at Coney Island a protection racket thing
Mm-hmm.
where Murder Incorporated burned down Coney Island because Coney Island wouldn't pay that for protection.
Nice.
That
Nice.
just came from reading those two news items in 1939, that Coney Island burned down and that Anastasia was trying to muscle his way into the Brooklyn waterfront. I'm like, well, Coney Island is on the Brooklyn waterfront. I know that's not the same thing as what they were actually talking about, which is longshoremen offloading, cargo ships and whatever. But anyway, that's always my argument for I didn't have a story for Kolchak. That story was waiting for me in copies of the New York Times from 1939.
Wow. Yeah.
You know, like
Yeah.
it was sitting there waiting. I've never seen a story about the fact that Coney Island burned down in 1939. I didn't know it had happened. Coney Island burned down 3 times, turns out, up to the present day. Never completely, but that was the worst one. And I turned it into a whole thing.
So as you're weaving stories and bringing stories together, that brings us to what you're exploring right now.
Well, it's funny. There's a word I just looked up today because I was writing about on Wednesday. I don't know when this is going to air, but on Wednesday, April 24th, um, Drawing Blood #1 drops.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that is in 1990, I read a review of Naked Lunch, the David Cronenberg movie about William Burroughs. And
Uh-huh.
the reviewer referred to it as an autobiographical fantasia on the life of William Burroughs. And what an appealing, evocative phrase that was. And I have used it to describe Drawing Blood. Drawing Blood is an autobiographical fantasia on the life of Kevin Eastman, who co-created the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And today I decided to not be uh not be the kind of pretentious person that uses big words he doesn't understand. And I looked up Fantasia. Like I was using it if that applies to Naked Lunch, it definitely applies to Drawing Blood in the sense that Naked Lunch, the movie, draws from all of Burroughs' writings, not just Naked Lunch. It
Mm-hmm.
borrows from his real life very strongly. There are things in the movie that are in his real life that aren't in any book he wrote. Um, and a fantasia, it turns out, is a musical term. It means something that relies heavily on improvisation and it is something that pulls together elements from disparate uh sources and makes
Hmm.
them into a single story. And I went, well, okay, then that I am using the right word. Oh, and something that also is a melange of styles that exist in
Nice.
different styles, which, by the way, as my wife pointed out, applies very strongly to the Walt Disney movie.
Hmm. True.
Different styles, influences from all over. When Leopold Stokowski, when not Stokowski, Stravinsky sat down to write The Rite of Spring. The Rite of Spring is about prehistoric fertility rites. There's a genius in going, no, it's about evolution. It's about the Big Bang and the amoeba becoming the dinosaurs.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
That's what we're going to make our movie about. That's a Fantasia. So this is very similar to that in that it is a it is very influenced by the real story of Kevin's life.
Hmm.
But it is changed for reasons that will make it a better story. Um, Kevin likes to say, yes, it's semi-autobiographical, but in the first 5 pages, the main character gets in a gunfight. I've never been in a gunfight in my life, you know. Um, but that's sort of our way of dramatizing. A life in show business does put you in contact with some shady human beings.
I'm sure. Yeah.
I have never been in a gunfight, but I will say that I was up for directing a movie once, and the project vanished overnight. Literally, I went back to the offices and the copper had been pulled out of the wall. Copper wire had been pulled out of the wall. It was that kind of thing. And a year later, I discovered that the producer, writer, star whose movie we were about to make had been assassinated by triads because the money we were going to use to make the movie was stolen from Chinese gangsters. So like
Wow.
that didn't affect me directly, but that definitely affected me writing about, showbiz deal goes wrong, ends in gunfight.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so Drawing Blood is about a guy named Shane Bookman who created a comic book series in the early 90s, influenced by the Ninja Turtles, called The Radically Rearranged Ronin Ragdolls, who are three cats. Un They are named not after Renaissance artists, but after Kevin had the idea to name them after anime directors to
Nice,
like
nice.
strengthen the Japanese influence. So the gentle poetic one is named Miyazaki, the tough violent one is named the Tomo, and the leader level-headed hero is named Tezuka.
Hmm. Hmm.
And design-wise, I wanted them all to have elements from those characters because they are like we don't pretend that those names are just accidents. When they're kittens, they are raised by a Japanese couple who run a sushi restaurant and they live above the sushi restaurant. Uh Kevin wanted to like sort of take everything about the turtles and make it the opposite. So he's like, the turtles live in the sewer, they live in a penthouse. Like
Uh,
they have to live in on the top of a building instead of under a building.
mhm, mhm.
So they grow up watching those cartoons and they pick their own names based on which
Nice.
movies are their favorites. So the idea is that they would model themselves. So Miyazaki has a little leather flying helmet like Nausicaa, and Tezuka has big shiny red boots like Astro Boy, and Atomo wears the red leather jacket from Akira, except on the back, she's instead of a pill, she's got a sushi nigiri,
Love
which
it.
I think
Love
was
it.
Troy Little's idea, which is such a great idea. But anyway, he created these characters. They became a global billion-dollar franchise. And then, like Kevin Eastman, he sold them off for a lot of reasons and started a quixotic publishing company. In the
Hmm.
real world, it was called Tundra. In ours, it's called Siberian Arts or Siberia Arts.
Nice, nice.
Uh, and his friends kind of take advantage of him and it goes under.
Mm.
And when we meet him, it's basically on its last legs, and his co-founder has committed suicide. And again, Dennis Kitchen did not, who Kevin took on as a partner after he had founded. Dennis Kitchen did not commit suicide. Dennis Kitchen was not embezzling money. Like none of that is true of Dennis Kitchen. Dennis is a very nice man, and not a criminal. But one of the big influences on Kevin, a thing that he really had a hard time wrapping his head around, he's a big fan of Wally Wood.
Hmm.
Wally Wood gave an interview once where someone asked him naively, innocently, not knowing how tortured Wally was by his life and career. What's it like being, such an iconic, you know, figure in the comics industry? And Wally said, if I had known how my life was going to turn out, I would have cut my drawing hand right off my body.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so how we decided to do that is we put that in the mouth of the Wally Wood character, who is unimaginatively named by me, Frank Forrest, says that to 12-year-old Bookman when he meets him at a convention. And then years later, they go into business together. And Forrest is not just Wally Wood. I like to say we follow the Venture Brothers uh, way of referencing the real world as opposed to the Family Guy version. In Family Guy's like, here's a reference. We didn't
Right.
change it. It's just exactly what it is. Whereas when Sean Connery shows up in the Venture Brothers as Colonel Gentleman, he's Sean Connery, but he's also Alan Quatermain from League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. And he's also kind of he's living in Tangier and shooting heroin. And he has a gay houseboy named Kiki. So, like, whoever decided that, like, retired James Bond becomes an old pervert drug addict, that's a hilarious idea. The Nick Fury character is
Hmm.
not just a tough guy with an eye patch. It's Hunter S. Thompson. He's Colonel Hunter de Gatherers, and he's also transsexual
Yeah.
because that's just in. So like, it's never a clean. So Frank Forrest is Wally Wood, and he's also 2% Dennis Kitchen, the part that's in business with Kevin Eastman, and he's also Bill Finger,
Hmm.
not getting credit for the work that he did. And he's also Jack Kirby, whose stuff becomes globally famous and he doesn't really benefit from it.
Hmm.
Because we created a character. The interesting thing about doing a comic book set in the comic book industry is you end up having to create multiple comic books. We started out thinking, well, we'll just have to create the ragdolls. But okay, then when we were writing the second or third issue, Kevin calls me up and says, so what's Frank Forrest famous for? Because I think I'd named the character the Night Avenger, and I said I'm the Night Avenger, and he said, okay, but what is the Night Avenger? We should know. We should know.
Yeah.
And I had this old superhero idea from years ago that I thought was fun, and I pitched it to him, and he said, oh yeah, great, that's who the Night Avenger is. Now we know. Now we can move forward with that. As an aside, around the time that Batman '89 came out, it was very fashionable to say, oh, what if Batman was, mentally unstable? And I went, well, okay, what if Batman's paranoid schizophrenic?
Hmm.
What if Bruce Wayne actually doesn't know he's Batman? What if he wakes
Hmm.
up in the morning and his knuckles are sore and he doesn't know the Batcave is there and he doesn't know he does it? And so the premise of Night Avenger, based on an old script I wrote in the '90s called The Nightmare. Um, since then, there have been too many characters named the Nightmare, so I was like, Night Avenger is a nice sort of. But Night Avenger is sort of he's Batman, he's the spirit, and Frank Forrest's career is got a little Siegel Schuster in it, where he sold it to some comic book company for $200, and then they made money off him for a zillion years and would trot him out every once in a while. And we did a thing where the one thing they let him keep doing was the newspaper strips,
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
way Stan Lee did the the Spider-Man newspaper strips. Like, it's one of the last things he was still writing. Um, and then when we wanted to do, like, well, we should do a Night Avenger thing, Kevin was like, let's do the newspaper strip. And I said, well, let's do the one that got him fired off his own strip. So in issue 2 of Drawing Blood, which comes out in a month and a week,
Hmm.
uh, is the 1972 Night Avenger Sunday strip about Kent State. where Night Avenger is on Kent State campus stopping a supervillain, and he hears gunfire, and he sees National Guardsmen shooting hippie protesters, and he beats them up.
Mm.
And in the last panel, the hippies are like, wow, we thought you were a fascist tool of the imperialist war machine, but you're actually kind of groovy. I mean, remembering it's a middle-aged guy writing, writing hippies. And
Right.
he says, free speech is the only, is a core American value, son, but get a haircut. Um, and the backstory is that Kingfisher Syndicate or whatever refused to run the strip. And when he wouldn't draw a replacement strip, they fired him off his own strip.
Mm.
So, like, even when we're doing, like, here's just a little piece of mythology so that you know what Night Avenger is and what the character looks like and what the costume looks like, we're also storytelling. We're also
Mhm.
telling why is Frank Forrest a suicidal, bitter old man? It's because everything has been taken from him,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And in his old age, he became a guy that he became he's like, okay, this young dumb kid has millions of dollars to start a publishing company. I'm going to steal from him
Mm.
because I was stolen from. So morally, it's correct for me to steal from him, which is a conclusion some people come to. Again, Bill Finger and Siegel and Schuster did not end up that way, and neither did
Right.
Wally Wood. But for the purpose of our story, it's a good way to talk about that kind of, thing that happens in publishing, where a
Hmm.
publisher can be a crook. But yeah, the first issue drops the 24th. We the Fantasia of it all partially we did this as a Kickstarter starting 5 years ago for the first four issues. Um, and ironically, it became a huge influence on Kevin's Last Ronin, which
Yeah.
used a
Yeah.
variety of art styles. When we were developing the book, I said to Kevin, I know you don't want to draw 20 pages a month. Like, I know you're not interested in doing that anymore. You got to draw something for me, though. Like, it can't just be covers. And we were like, well, there are flashbacks in the
Uh-huh.
book. He'll
Uh-huh.
draw the flashbacks. And the character also has recurring hallucinations, dreams, where he imagines the rag dolls coming to life and talking to him.
Uh-huh.
So we got Ben Bishop to do sort of the photorealistic present day reality. Kevin does the flashbacks in the very 1980s. He's still using the duo shade paper that he held on to from the 80s, which is you can't even get it anymore. So it's got that sepia tone dot, spatter look of
Uh,
early Ninja Turtles comics. And then the hallucinations are drawn by Troy Little, who also draws the Ragdolls comics. And we
love the
did a
arrangement.
full 32-page first issue of the Ragdolls, which we're holding on to this time around. We're doing drawing. Last time we tried to do this, we released Drawing Blood #1 and Ragdolls #1 the same month, and Ragdolls totally overshadowed Drawing Blood. Nobody bought Drawing Blood. Everybody bought the funny animals doing martial arts. And we went,
Mm.
okay, let's not do that again. So the first time I think the new audience will see the Ragdolls #1 is in the trade paperback. When we release in I think September, October, we're doing the first four issues, and that will have as a bonus the 32-page Ragdolls origin issue in it. And we've got four other Ragdolls issues done, actually. Two 20-page each, I should say two 40-page two-part stories that are, since we're using the Ragdolls to comment on the history of comic books, um, the first Ragdolls issue was the layouts were Kevin,
Mm. Mm.
and Troy Little drew, inked them. And when we came back to Troy, he said, guys, I love you, and I love how it came out, but do not make me ink Kevin Eastman ever again. Uh, he's like, it's so different from Troy draws in a sort of cartoony, exaggerating style, and you kind of can't do that exactly with Kevin's layouts. And he said, and also, I feel like I'm painting over the Sistine Chapel. It's like the layouts are gorgeous,
Hmm.
and my
Hmm.
final art is going to look nothing like them. And I just hated, I felt bad every day. So because of his cartoony style, he suggested, why don't we do the comic book that's the tie-in to the, Nickelodeon animated version of the Ragdolls?
Mhm,
So it can
mhm,
be a much cartoonier style. It can be more broad. The stories don't have to be 80s Ninja Turtles gritty. They can be 90s Nickelodeon, Saban entertainment sweet and
mhm.
simple. So we've done four of those now. I've Troy has more of a head for that kind of thing. So Troy pitched us a story, and I said, do an outline and I'll turn it into a full script, and then we'll go from there. So we finished a two-parter for that, and then we're in the middle of another two-parter. And that'll again, all of this stuff will be released down the road. And
Nice.
again, in the fourth issue of Drawing Blood, which will be April, May, June, July, takes place at New York Comic Con, and it satirizes the moment when I don't know if you remember, but Michael Bay gave an interview when his Ninja Turtles was in pre-production, where he said they would be aliens, not turtles.
Uh-huh, uh-huh,
And and the fans went nuts, and the
uh-huh.
studio sort of dragged Kevin out to make it all okay and to say, no, 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 he didn't mean it, and we're not doing that. That is satirized very heavily in the fourth issue of Drawing Blood. But he also meets a teenage woman who is a webcomics artist, creator, and she created a character called GTFO Girl,
Uh,
and who's kind of a tank girl, but a little more bisexual, or I should say pansexual, a little more queer, a little more interesting.
uh-huh.
Not that Tank Girl doesn't already have a bunch of that, but it's a post-apocalyptic punk girl kind of a thing. And I said to Kevin, I'd really like to do like a 4-page GTFO girl comic. And I said, but I don't want to write it and I don't want, I said, let me find two women to
Uh-huh.
do that. And so I asked the very great Amanda Dibert Staggs to
Uh-huh.
write it, and she did. And she did a tremendous job. And Skylar Patridge is drawing it. And I
Nice,
think
nice.
she's just about done with the inks. And Dave Acosta drew the who's my old Elvira artist, did the Night Avenger strip.
Love that.
Um,
Love
so
that.
that's and one of my long-term like ridiculous goals is I want to write like a 40 or 60 page Marvel Comics official adaptation of the 1989 Tim Burton Night Avenger movie.
Nice, nice.
Or let's say, 94, whenever, when like maybe something he made between Batman and Beetlejuice
Uh-huh.
or after Beetlejuice. Uh And I've told Dave like I wanted you at your most like Sal Buscema. Like, and
Nice.
not Sal doing a good job, Sal phoning it in because it's a rush job and they need the pages by Monday. Um, and I think that'll be hilarious and worthwhile and funny, and it'll allow me to give that character more of a life.
I'm
But
on board for it. That sounds
but
great.
yeah, but yeah, I think comics fans will dig it. I think Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle fans will see it as somewhat of a behind the curtain look. Um, I mean, the question I get asked almost the most about it by fans of TMNT, they're expecting more of a one-to-one. And in the comic, I suggested to Kevin that instead of it being two guys who are roommates, I actually stole this idea from the 1937 film Lost Horizon. In the book, George Conroy is uh or excuse me, can't remember Conroy's first name, is convinced to leave Shangri-La by a coworker. And when Frank Capra made the movie, he went, your coworker cannot convince you to leave Shangri-La. Your younger brother, who you feel responsible for, who's about to go out and die in the Himalayas somewhere, he can convince you that you need to leave to look after him.
Mhm,
So I
mhm.
said, going off of that, it's a more fraught relationship, brothers, and it's more
Yeah.
emotional and it's more complicated. So instead of Peter Laird just being some friend, very close friend, is if he's his older brother and
Mm.
they have always had a contentious relationship, that makes it a thing I feel easier. I'll have an easier time writing. Um, and when people ask me, like, is he based on Peter Laird, I say, I've never met Peter Laird, but I have a lousy relationship with my sister. So Paul Bookman
Nice.
is really based more strongly on my own family and not on the co-creator of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Um, but yeah, it's still there's enough reality there that I think it'll be interesting for people. And again, we understand the challenge. One of the reasons we made a Ragdolls comic, when we were prepping it, I said, we're trying to sell all that jazz to people who love the Power Rangers. That's not the easiest thing to do.
So love the creativity, love the vision, and the many, many layers. Where can folks go to find the book?
It will be in all comic book stores, fingers crossed. I don't know if I can say, but I just found out that our first printing sold out.
Nice.
So I
Congratulations.
think there will be a second printing with a different cover,
Cool, cool.
with a new cover of it. But it's coming from Image Comics.
Hmm,
Um,
hmm.
it's one of those things where this comic is a truly indie comic, and had a fairly torturous roller coaster of its own to get to the public. But as Kevin and I discussed when Image decided to pick it up and publish it, we got a great reaction we sent it to Eric Stevenson. Um, and it was kind of that thing where I think we had danced around each other and some signals got crossed because when we sent it to Eric, he's like, "Didn't I ask you guys to read this a year ago?" And we were like, neither of us remembered that, but I'm glad we eventually got it. Eric Larson, I have to shout out because Eric was the one who Kevin reached out to Eric and said, "Can you tap Eric Stevenson on the shoulder and remind him about this comic and that maybe we would have a home at Image?" And we're very happy. No shade on any company I've ever worked with before, but they're a very well-run company.
Nice.
I love Dynamite, but they're a little critically understaffed for the amount of amazing comics they put out.
Hmm.
And Image does not seem understaffed. They like I hear from people I've never heard from before and go, "Oh, you're the woman who takes care of that. That's cool. I'm glad that there's a person on that specific issue. That's great." So yeah, we're very excited about that, and it'll be in stores Wednesday, the 24th. There are 4 covers. I think only 3 will be in most store. One is a retailer variant that may only be available through that retailer, but there is a Kevin Eastman cover,
Nice,
which is a
nice.
full painted cover that looks like nothing else on the shelves right now. It's gorgeous. There is a Ben Bishop cover, which I like very much in the style of the interior art. And then our C covers will always be different,
Hmm.
a different artist every issue. And for this one, we've recolored it and it's a different kind of look now, but it was from our Kickstarter campaign. Kevin is good friends with the writer director, Robert Rodriguez.
Hmm, hmm.
This is again that magic. When we were talking to Robert about doing a cover, I don't remember who suggested it, but someone suggested, how about just the El Mariachi cover?
Yeah,
The El Mariachi poster, and instead of it being a guitar, it's a portfolio with Ragdoll's art coming out of it, and then the machine gun walking down the center of the road on the yellow lines. Here's
nice,
the
nice.
magic part. In making it a pastiche of Kevin's life, we changed turtles to cats.
Mm-hmm.
Did you remember that there's a turtle on the El Mariachi poster?
I did not remember
There,
that.
there is a friggin' turtle
Just
on
crawling
the
down the road?
just crawling towards him down the road, walking actually perpendicular to his path. And it's and I know there are turtles in the desert, like Blade Runner told me so, but it's still kind of amazing to see the tortoise walking across the road in that poster. And when I looked at that, I was like, oh my God. And then on ours, it'll be a cat.
Yeah,
So the C cover is an artistic collaboration between Robert, Kevin, and Ben. That's the El
wow.
Mariachi poster, but he's got art in one hand, and there's a friggin' cat walking across the road in front of him to represent the swapping out of turtles for cats. Um,
Perfect.
so yeah, we've got some great cover artists dialed in. Um, One of the plot lines in it is that the Bookman character hasn't drawn anything in years. That's part of the burnout is losing connection to the art that made you want to do it in the first place. So the
Mm-hmm.
Shane Bookman character hasn't drawn anything in years. And the artistic project he's working on, the ridiculous thing he's spending his time and money and energy on, is a Broadway musical based on the Fritz Lang silent film Metropolis. And so the C cover on the second issue, Troy Little did that, a combination of the Bohemian Rhapsody Queen
Uh-huh.
pose,
Uh-huh.
where it's Shane Bookman with the three cats behind him, but that's also a reference to the Radio Gaga Queen music video, which is Metropolis,
I remember that.
and has
Yeah,
the
yeah.
imagery from Metropolis in it. So it's really, really clever. We have a Amanda Connor cover
Uh-huh.
coming
Uh-huh.
up. We have a Mateo Santaluco cover coming up. I think I can announce, since we just got it the other day, we have a Matt Wagner cover, which makes my 80s comic
Yeah.
uh, heart a flutter. Beautifully colored by his son Brendan, and I actually posed for the I couldn't help myself. I posed for the I gave him a photo reference for the image. And I posed, and our main character has a mustache. So it's a very pretty detailed cover
Nice,
photo
nice.
reference, and he followed it really well. But yeah, we're very excited to make it as much of a community effort as humanly possible.
Well, awesome, awesome things. I'm looking forward to checking it out and seeing these mini worlds that splinter from it as well. Oh my goodness, Splinter right there.
Yeah.
So an intended reference.
Yes.
Um, but
Yes.
I always know that I'm in for a treat to talk with you, and I always know that
Thank you,
I'm in
Jason.
for a layered experience of references and in jokes. And I think
I
we
know it's
have
exhausting. I'm sorry.
no, no, it's a shared love of film as well. So,
Yeah.
uh, always glad to talk with you and looking forward to the issues as they come out.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you.